This media content has been produced by Building Control Surveyors Corporate Approved Inspectors and is based upon the 2018 source material from the Building Control Alliance's Final Certificate Protocol. You should also have a copy of the Building Act 1984, the Building Regulations and the Building Approved Inspector etc. Regulations, for your immediate reference and study. An actual copy of the protocol can be downloaded from our network servers or directly from their BCA website at www.buildingcontrolalliance.org. The Building Act 1984 imparts a duty on a person carrying out building work to comply with building regulations. The person carrying out the work must give notice to a local authority in accordance with the building regulations. The building control body, in other words the BCB, may be a local authority who would receive a building notice or full plans application, or an approved inspector who would give to the local authority an initial notice. It is the responsibility of the BCB to take such steps as are reasonable to be satisfied that the work complies with building regulation requirements as in Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations. Section 51(1) of the Building Act 1984 provides that an approved inspector shall issue a final certificate where they are satisfied that any work to which an initial notice relates has been completed. There is no time limit for compliance with this requirement in the Building Act, but under Regulation 17 of the Building Approved Inspectors etc. Regulations 2010 there are time limits related to the completion of work or occupation before completion under which the initial notice will lapse, once these preconditions have been determined by the approved inspector. The Act provides that part final certificates may be issued, in respect to that part of the work to which an initial notice relates. Regulation 17(6) does not prevent an initial notice from lapsing once a part final certificate has been issued. The requirement to issue a final certificate under Section 51(1) of the Act is not satisfied by the issue of a part final certificate. Furthermore, part final certificates, under Section 50(5) of the Building Act 1984, when applied to final certificates by Section 51(2), states that a final certificate, and I quote, may relate either to the whole, or to part only, of the work to which the initial notice concerned relates. End quote. Paragraph 2 of Form 5 in Schedule 1 of the Approved Inspector Regulations 2010 includes an option for the approved inspector to issue a final certificate in respect of part of the work described in an initial notice. The Act does not specify the different circumstances where a part final certificate could be given. However, Building Control Alliance's view is that a partial final certificate should only be issued for distinct parts of the work covered by the initial notice, which can be independently occupied. Examples of this would be a dwelling, b. an apartment in a larger block, c. floor of an office or commercial building. When issuing a partial final certificate, approved inspectors should satisfy themselves that all areas of the regulations have been complied with for that part of the works. For example, for an apartment in a block, the common areas and means of escape serving that apartment should be complete and free from obstruction at all times, and any statutory consultations have been carried out. We also feel that the developer's fire risk assessments at that point should cover a building subject to a part final certificate. Now, considering the requirement to issue a final certificate. As approved inspectors, we maintain a responsibility for the remaining work covered by the initial notice. The issuing of a partial final certificate does not absolve an approved inspector of their responsibility to issue a final certificate under Section 51(1) of the Act. I now move on to address the issuing of final certificates which involved work carried out by third-party competent persons. Building regulations allow third-party certification for certain parts of the work, such as energy efficiency, water efficiency and sound testing. The regulations also allow a building control body to accept third-party certificates attesting compliance for some types of work, notably that are described in Schedule 3 of the Building Regulations, for competent persons schemes. Conflicting timing allowances and constraints within the legislation may compromise the issuing of a final certificate by an approved inspector. Where work covered within the scope of the initial notice has been carried out by a third-party competent person, the guidance is intended to ensure the building owner or person carrying out the work is not left with the responsibility, or liable to prosecution for failure of a third party to correctly issue a certificate of compliance and to avoid cancellation of an initial notice by default. The following actions are appropriate where all parties have reason to believe that the functional requirements of building regulations have been or will be satisfied, but appropriate third-party certificates have not been received by the BCB within an appropriate time after occupation of a building. 1. The approved inspector could satisfy themselves by their own inspection, or sight of relevant site or homeowner records, to verify that the packages of work have been carried out by suitably qualified competent persons, such that an appropriate compliance certificate will be forthcoming from the competent person scheme operator. This, for example, could be a benchmark certificate, or a building owner certificate. 2. If the above information is not available, a final certificate or partial final certificate should not be issued, and an extension of time should be requested from the local authority in accordance with Regulation 17.7 of the Approved Inspector Regulations. Now, to address the matter of applying to a local authority for an extension of time, the Approved Inspector Regulations require an approved inspector shall issue a final certificate within 4 weeks of occupation for buildings other than dwellings, or 8 weeks for dwellings. Regulation 17.7 of the Approved Inspector Regulations allows a local authority to extend the above time periods either before or after expiry. Therefore, to avoid a lapse of the initial notice, and automatic reversion to the relevant local authority, it is recommended the following action be taken as soon as reasonably practicable after the approved inspector becomes aware that the initial notice will cease, or has ceased to be in force. The Building Control Alliance's view is that it is inappropriate to request an extension of time where the matters preventing the issuing of a final or partial final certificates are life safety issues, for example means of escape. The approved inspector remains responsible for the remaining work covered by the initial notice. The agreement by a local authority to an extension of time does not absolve the approved inspector of their responsibility to issue a final certificate under Section 51(1) of the Act. The approved inspector should make a request in writing to the local authority for an extension of time. Although not considered necessary at this stage, the approved inspector may wish to share the reasons for requesting the extension of time. Local authorities are encouraged to give favorable consideration to requests for extensions of time and are encouraged to consider the wider interests of the building owner. There is no obligation on a local authority to extend a relevant period, and an approved inspector must not assume a request for extension of time will automatically be granted. A point to mention at this time is, under Section 53, Subparagraph 7 of the Building Act 1984 states, the fact that an initial notice has ceased to be enforced does not affect the right to give a new initial notice relating to any of the work that was specified in the original notice and in respect of which no final certificate has been given and accepted. But where a plan certificate has been given in respect of any of that work, b the conditions in paragraphs a, 2, c, of subsection 2 of the Act above are fulfilled with respect to that certificate, and c. such a new initial notice is given and accepted. Section 51 above does not apply in relation to so much of the work to which the new initial notice relates, as is work specified in the plan certificate. In instances where the local authority has reasonable concerns about granting the need for an extension of time, for example, 1. The local authority has concerns that the building, or the part of the building covered by the extension of time is clearly not in an occupiable state, or 2. If discussions have already taken place between the approved inspector and the local authority about reverting the initial notice, it may be appropriate for the local authority to contact the approved inspector and request the following information. A. The reason for the request being made and the circumstances that make it necessary, including details of any outstanding work included in the initial notice, any known building regulation contraventions, and outstanding third-party certification of work by competent persons. B. An indication of the length of time needed to resolve outstanding matters. Where the approved inspector provides reasonable justification, local authorities are encouraged to give favorable consideration to requests for an extension of time that include the above information providing, that is, 1. The request is made before the initial notice has lapsed or within a reasonable time after the Initial notice has lapsed and ceased to be in force. 2. There is reason to believe that outstanding matters can be resolved within the extended time period. 3. The local authority has not itself taken positive steps to supervise the work on reversion of work described in the initial notice. An approved inspector should not cancel an initial notice before or after expiry of the relevant period, without giving notice in writing to the person carrying out the work, of any contraventions in accordance with Regulation 18 of the Building Approved Inspectors etc. Regulations 2010. All requests and responses should be in writing. Email is considered suitable.